This portrait hangs in Madrid. It shows a pale young man in black velvet, a gold chain across his chest, a soft white collar, one hand resting on a table. It was painted to prove that the Spanish crown had a healthy air. Look at the shoulders. The painter set them level. They were not level. One rode higher than the other. One leg was shorter than its twin, and the young man walked with a lurch that every ambassador in Europe described in code, because describing it plainly would have been an insult to the most powerful family on earth. His name was Don Carlos. He was the only surviving son of Philip II of Spain. His father owned silver mines on the other side of the ocean. His father commanded armies in 3 countries and fleets in 2 seas. His father could not give him a straight spine. This is the story of where that body came from, what it did to him, and what his father finally did about it. It ends behind a door in the Alcázar of Madrid, a door that was nailed shut and guarded by men who had orders never to open it. The king who gave that order never explained it publicly, not once, for the rest of his life. Europe filled the silence with the worst story it could invent, and the worst story was wrong. The truth underneath it does not require a murderer. It only requires a family, a marriage contract, and arithmetic. Start with the arithmetic, because everything else grows out of it. Every human being has 8 great-grandparents. That is the ordinary number, the number you have, the number almost everyone who has ever lived has had. Don Carlos had 4. Not 4 grandparents, 4 great-grandparents, where the ordinary count is double that. His father Philip and his mother Maria Manuela were first cousins twice over, related through both the paternal and the maternal line at once. Their own parents had done the same thing before them, and their parents before that. 4 generations of the House of Habsburg had married inward, deliberately, as policy, and this young man in black velvet was the sum of it. Juana of Castile stands in his family tree more than once. History gave her the name Juana la Loca, which the period translated as Juana the Mad, and she spent the last decades of her life confined in a fortress at Tordesillas by her own relatives. She is not a distant ancestor of Carlos. She is his great-grandmother on one side and his great-grandmother again on another, the same woman entering the same bloodline twice. What she actually suffered from, and whether she suffered from anything at all beyond the ambition of the men around her, is still argued by historians. Her confinement is not argued. It happened, and it lasted almost half a century. Nobody at the Spanish court called any of this inbreeding. The word did not exist yet, and the concept behind it was not medicine, but livestock. Breeders of horses and cattle knew perfectly well what happened when you bred close relatives for too many generations, and they had known it for centuries. Nobody applied that knowledge upward to kings. The marriages were not accidents, and they were not romance. They were the most effective financial instrument in Europe. Every time a Habsburg married outside the family, land walked out of the family with the bride. Every time a Habsburg married inside it, land stayed. Austria, Burgundy, Castile, Aragon, the Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and eventually half of the New World were assembled by wedding contracts rather than by conquest. It was the cheapest empire ever built. It was also the only empire in history that was slowly poisoning the men who inherited it. Rome supplied the necessary paperwork. Marriage between first cousins required a papal dispensation, a document that formally set aside canon law for this particular couple. The Habsburgs obtained them again and again, and the papacy granted them again and again. because the Habsburgs were the sword and the purse of Catholic Europe, and no pope in that century was going to refuse them. The dispensations survive. They are dry, legal, and utterly polite. Not one of them mentions a child. The child arrived in Valladolid on the 8th of July in the year 1545. Picture the room, because the room matters. A birth chamber of that century was sealed against drafts, the windows shuttered, the air thick with the smoke of tallow candles and the sourness of wine used to wash the linen. Physicians of the highest rank in Spain waited outside, because the actual work belonged to midwives, and the physicians would only be summoned when something went wrong. Something went wrong. The mother was Maria Manuela of Portugal. She was 17 years old. She was also her husband's double first cousin, which meant her body carried the same narrowed inheritance the child would. The delivery was long, and it damaged her. She survived it by 4 days. In those 4 days, she developed the fever that killed almost every woman it touched in that century, and the most learned medical men in the Spanish kingdoms could offer her bleeding, purging, and prayer. She died on the 12th of July, at 17, a wife for less than 2 years, and a mother for less than a week. The letters from that week describe the mother's death at length. They describe the child in one line, and the line says, "He lives." Nobody wrote down what the midwives saw when they lifted him, but the shoulders that a painter would later be paid to level were already uneven that morning, and every woman in that room had delivered enough infants to recognize it. So had the physicians who came in afterwards. Not one of them recorded it. Here is the part that reaches across 4.5 centuries and touches anyone who has ever stood in a hospital corridor. There is a silence that falls in a room when the professionals stop talking to each other. Everyone present understands what it means. Nobody says it out loud, and the family is the last to be told. That silence has not changed since 1545. Only the lighting has. The court replaced the silence with celebration. Bells rang across Castile for the birth of an heir, and the same bells rang days later for his mother. Philip was 18 years old and a widower. He would go on to marry 3 more times and to become the ruler of the largest empire the world had yet seen. He never brought Maria Manuela's body back to be buried beside his own, and he almost never spoke of her again. The boy grew up in a country his father was rarely in. That sentence is not a metaphor. Philip spent years at a stretch outside Spain, in the Netherlands, in Italy, and then in England, where he was married to Mary Tudor and held the title of king while his son learned to speak in a palace 2,000 miles away. Letters crossed the water. The father asked after the child's health in the formal phrases of the period. He did not come home to see him. So the household raised him. His aunts oversaw him from a distance. His governess fed and dressed him, and a rotating staff of servants, grooms, and tutors made up the whole of his daily world. He grew attached to servants with a fierceness that later observers found excessive, and it is not difficult to see why. They were the only people who never left. His body announced itself early, and it never stopped announcing itself. He was small for his age and stayed small. He ate with difficulty, and the food that other children swallowed without thought had to be cut and softened for him. He ran fevers so often that the household kept physicians permanently attached to him, and each fever left him thinner than the one before. Ambassadors reported all of it, because a foreign prince's health was intelligence of the first order, and every court in Europe was pricing it. Then there was his speech. He spoke slowly, he stammered, and certain sounds he could not form at all. The Venetian diplomats, who were the finest professional observers of the age, described a young man whose words came out crooked and whose meaning arrived late. The Spanish court had a word for it. The word was not kind. None of it made him less royal. He was still the sole legitimate son, the sole heir, the single thread on which the succession of the largest empire on earth was hanging, and every fever he ran was watched by governments in 4 capitals. His tutors did what tutors of royal children have always done. They taught what they could, they praised what they could praise, and when the reports went north to the king, they went through hands that smoothed them first. A tutor who wrote plainly about a prince's incapacity was writing his own dismissal, and possibly worse. So the reports arrived polished. The king in his distant palace read that his son was making progress in Latin, that his health had improved, that his temper was steadier. The reports were not lies, they were edited truths which travel further. And somewhere in that gap between what was written and what was actually happening, the boy in black velvet became a young man that nobody at court had honestly described to the one person who would eventually have to judge him. By the time Philip finally came home and looked at his son with his own eyes, the thing they had all been not writing about had been growing for 11 years. What happened next did not happen because of the blood. It happened on a staircase. The schoolroom was in Alcalá de Henares, in a university town half a day's ride from Madrid, and it was the best that money and empire could assemble. The tutors were chosen with enormous care. The syllabus was the standard education of a Renaissance prince: Latin, theology, the history of his own dynasty, the geography of territories he was expected to rule, horsemanship, the handling of weapons, and the elaborate court manners without which a Spanish king could not function. Boys of good family were brought in as companions so that he would learn among equals rather than alone. Everything about the arrangement was correct. Almost none of it worked. At the center of it stood a man named Honorato Juan, a Valencian scholar of real distinction who later became a bishop. He was patient, he was devout, and he was fond of the boy in a way that comes through his correspondence without ever being stated. He also could not make the reports say what the court wanted them to say. Carlos learned to read. He never learned to read easily. Latin, which any nobleman's son of that century absorbed like breathing, resisted him for years and then only partly gave way. He could sit through instruction, and he could repeat what he had been told, but the connections between the pieces did not lock together the way they locked for the other boys in that room. His memory was uneven, sharp on things that interested him, blank on things that did not. And the stammer that had marked his speech since infancy made every oral examination, which was how princes were tested, a public ordeal. Honorato Juan wrote what he saw. He praised what could be praised, and there was something to praise. The boy was not stupid, and everyone who spent time with him said so. He was curious. He asked about maps. He remembered the names of servants and the details of their families, which is not the behavior of a mind that cannot hold information. The gap was never between his intelligence and his rank. The gap was between what a 16th century king had to be able to do: sit for hours in council, read dispatches in 4 languages, ride at the head of an army, speak in public without hesitation, and what this particular body would allow. His father, meanwhile, was reading a version of the schoolroom that had been sanded smooth by everyone it passed through. The silence that began in the birth chamber at Valladolid never actually broke. It simply changed hands, moving from midwives to physicians, to tutors, to secretaries, each of them writing a little less than they knew, until the king in his cabinet held a picture of his son that was accurate in every detail except the important ones. There was one group of men in Spain who wrote the truth down without softening it. They were foreigners, and they were paid to be accurate.
The Republic of Venice ran what was probably the finest intelligence service in Europe,
and its ambassadors filed a report at the end of every posting called a relazione, a full written assessment of the court they had been watching. These documents were read aloud to the Venetian Senate and then archived. They were never meant to flatter anyone, because a flattering report was a useless report, and Venice was a state that lived or died by knowing things first. So the Venetians described Don Carlos exactly as they saw him. They wrote about his height, which was well below normal for a man of his years. They wrote about the shoulders, one visibly higher than the other. They noted that he limped. They recorded the speech impediment plainly, and one of them observed that the prince's words came with difficulty and that strangers often could not follow him. They wrote about the fevers, which came without warning and left him bedridden for weeks. They wrote about his eating, which was disordered. Long refusals followed by enormous bouts of consumption that made him ill. Not one word of this was gossip. It was commercial and strategic information of the highest value, because Venice needed to know a single thing above all others: whether the greatest empire in the world was going to have a functioning king in the next generation, or a crisis. Their answer, filed year after year, was consistent. Spain was in trouble. If you are finding this history worth your time, a thumbs up genuinely helps it reach other people who like documents more than legends. And there are documents in this story that almost nobody has read. The imperial ambassadors from Vienna wrote the same, in their own cipher, to the same purpose. The French wrote it. The papal nuncio wrote it. Every serious observer in Madrid was quietly cataloging the body of a young man who had never done anything to any of them, because his spine was a matter of European security. Consider what that does to a person at 14, at 15, at 16. Every meal watched, every stumble on a staircase noted and sent abroad by evening. Every sentence he struggled to finish reported to men he would never meet, in cities he would never see, and weighed as evidence about his fitness to exist in his own life. There has never been a more thoroughly documented adolescence in the 16th century, and there has rarely been a lonelier one. He began to behave badly. This is the part of the story that everyone repeats, and it is the part that needs handling with the most care. The accounts describe a violent temper. There is the story of animals mistreated, hares taken alive and killed slowly, horses ridden until they were ruined. There is the story of a shoemaker who delivered boots that did not fit, and whom Carlos ordered to be forced to eat the leather. There are stories of servants struck, of a man threatened out of a window, of rages that emptied a room. Some of it is almost certainly true. Adolescents in absolute power with no supervision and constant pain have behaved this way in every century, and Carlos had the additional burden of a household that could not legally refuse him anything and could not legally give him any real responsibility either. Here is the part the popular version leaves out. Nearly every one of those anecdotes reaches us through men who, within a few years, urgently needed the prince to look unfit. Court officials who served his father, diplomats writing for governments with an interest in the Spanish succession, chroniclers writing after the fact under a king who had made a decision about his son and required that decision to look reasonable. Not a single one of these stories comes from a neutral witness with nothing to gain. The shoemaker story in particular appears nowhere in any contemporary Spanish document. It surfaces later, abroad, in the pamphlet literature of Spain's enemies, and it has been repeated for 400 years because it is memorable rather than because it is sourced. So the honest position is uncomfortable, and it is the only defensible one. The rages happened. The specific atrocities that made him famous are unverifiable, and they were transmitted almost exclusively by people who profited from them. The court responded the way courts always respond. It began to manage him. He appeared in public less. Audiences were shortened and then filtered, and then arranged in advance so that nothing unpredictable could occur. The household around him was reorganized, and the new appointments came from his father's men rather than his own. He was surrounded by people whose first loyalty ran past him to the king, and he knew it, because he was not a fool. The world reacted to his body long before it ever reacted to him. And somewhere in this period, a decision was quietly taken about how much authority this prince would ever be given, though the man who took it never announced it and never wrote it down. Then, in 1560, Philip did something that looks, from a distance, like the opposite of everything just described. He summoned the Cortes of Castile, the assembly of the realm, and had his son formally sworn as heir. The oath was taken in the monastery of San Jerónimo in Madrid, before the nobility and the deputies of the cities, with the full weight of ceremony that Spain reserved for the most important acts of state. The prince who could not finish a sentence in public was publicly acknowledged as the future ruler of Castile, of Aragon, of Naples, of the Netherlands, and of a hemisphere on the other side of the ocean. Every man in that church had read or heard the same reports the Venetians were filing. They swore anyway. There was no alternative heir, and an empire without a named successor was an empire inviting civil war, so the fiction was performed in full, and everyone present kept a straight face. The accounts of his household from the following year survive, and they are the saddest documents in this entire story. They show a young man with an income larger than that of most sovereign princes in Europe. They show purchases of jewels, cloth, weapons, horses, small silver objects, and books. They show him giving nearly all of it away, to servants, to companions, to almost anyone who came near him, with a generosity that his father's officials found alarming and that reads, across 4 centuries, like something much simpler than extravagance. He had the wealth of a king and the authority of a child. He could buy anything in Spain and command nothing in it. That was the arrangement in the spring of 1562, and it might have held for years. What broke it took less than a minute, on a set of stone steps in Alcalá, and what the physicians then did to him is the strangest thing in this entire story. So far, this has been a story about blood. A dynasty that married inward for 4 generations. A prince born with uneven shoulders and a stammer. A court that catalogued his body for foreign governments and swore him in as heir anyway. But nobody can explain what happened next by pointing at his ancestors. Because what happened next happened on a staircase, in under a minute. And everything Europe would later say about Don Carlos begins there. The most famous madness of the Spanish century may have started with a fractured skull. The date is the 19th of April, 1562. Carlos was 16. He was living at Alcalá de Henares in the Archbishop's palace beside the university, and, by every account, he was in reasonable health for him, which meant thin, unsteady on his feet, and prone to fevers, but upright and active. He was going down a narrow stone staircase in a service part of the building. There was a doorway at the bottom, low and dark. What he was doing there is the one detail the sources treat with visible discomfort, and the traditional account says he was on his way to meet the daughter of the palace gardener. He fell. His head struck the stone. The wound was on the back of the head, behind and above the left ear. It bled, and the bleeding stopped, and for a day or two the household believed the worst was over. That belief was the single most dangerous mistake anyone made that spring, because the injury underneath had not stopped doing anything at all. The swelling came slowly. Fever followed. Within a week, the prince could not see clearly. His face had begun to distort on one side, and the wound had turned into something the physicians of that age could describe perfectly and treat almost not at all. Infection had reached the bone. By the beginning of May, the most powerful empire on earth was watching its only heir die by degrees in a provincial university town. There is a moment in that sick room that belongs to no century in particular. Philip II came to Alcalá. The man who had spent his son's entire childhood in other countries, who governed the world by paperwork and rarely raised his voice, sat by the bed and looked at a boy whose head was swollen out of shape and who no longer always recognized the people around him. The king's secretaries recorded that he wept, which almost nothing else in his long life ever made him do. He stayed for days. Then he left, because the physicians told him the prince would die within hours, and a king could not be present at that. Anyone who has sat in a room where the professionals have quietly stopped promising anything knows precisely what that departure meant. The most powerful man alive left because staying had become unbearable, and no amount of silver or armies changed that by a single hour. What he left behind was one of the strangest medical scenes of the entire Renaissance. There were 8 physicians in that chamber, and they could not agree on anything. Understand what medicine actually was in 1562. It was a system built on the 4 humors, on the balance of blood and bile and phlegm, and its main instruments were the lancet, the purge, and the poultice. The room was kept dark and hot. The windows shuttered against what was believed to be corrupted air. They bled him repeatedly, which weakened a patient already burning with fever. They applied ointments made of things that would horrify a modern pharmacist. They shaved his head and dressed the wound with compresses. None of it touched the problem, which was pus under the bone. Alcalá then produced its most desperate consultation. A Moorish healer from Valencia named Pintorete was brought in, a man outside the Christian medical establishment entirely, in a country where the Inquisition was very much awake, and the fact that the court permitted him near the heir tells you exactly how far past hope everyone had gone. He applied his own ointments. The prince got worse. Then the relic arrived, and then the surgeon, and Spain has argued for 4 centuries about which of them saved him. The surgeon was Andreas Vesalius. He was the most important anatomist who had ever lived, the man whose great book had overturned 1,000 years of inherited error by the radical method of actually cutting bodies open and looking. And he was in Spain as physician to the king. He examined the wound and said what none of the Spanish physicians would say. The skull had to be opened. The others resisted. Opening a living skull in that century killed most of the people it was performed on, and the man who held the blade when a royal heir died on the table was unlikely to enjoy a long retirement. Vesalius argued anyway. So this may be roughly how it sounded, in a hot, dark room in early May, from the only man present who had spent his life inside the human head. The swelling is beneath the bone, and no ointment on earth reaches beneath bone. They cut. The instrument was a trepan, a bit that bores a circular hole through the skull, turned by hand. There was no anesthetic beyond wine and opiates, and no antiseptic of any kind. The accounts differ on how far they went, whether the bone was fully perforated or only scraped and the wound opened to drain, and the surviving descriptions are frustratingly imprecise. Something was released. The pressure came off. At almost the same hour, the town of Alcalá supplied its own remedy. They went to the Franciscan convent and took out the body of Fray Diego, a lay brother who had died there roughly 100 years earlier and whose corpse was said to be uncorrupted They carried the mummified friar through the streets in procession, up into the palace, into the sick room, and they laid the dry body of a dead man in the bed beside the living boy. His face was touched with the cloth that had wrapped it. That night, the fever broke. Carlos later said he had seen the friar standing at his bedside, holding a wooden cross, telling him he would live. Spain took that as a verdict. The recovery of the heir was declared a miracle. Philip pressed Rome for years afterwards, and Fray Diego de Alcalá was formally canonized, the only saint in the history of the Church whose canonization rests substantially on the survival of Don Carlos. A city in California carries that saint's name to this day, and almost nobody who says it knows that it travels back to a trepanned skull in a shuttered room. The surgeon got nothing. Vesalius, the greatest anatomist of the age, was thanked politely and left out of the story, and within 2 years he was dead on a Greek island on his way back from Jerusalem. Now comes the part that changes everything, and it is not the miracle. Carlos recovered. He was not the same person. This is not a legend, and it is not a later invention by his enemies. It is the most consistent single observation in the entire archive. Every witness who knew him before Alcalá and saw him afterwards describes a change, and they date it to the fall. Before the staircase, the reports say difficult, sickly, slow of speech, stubborn, and generous. After it, they say something else entirely. The rages became explosive rather than merely bad-tempered, arriving without warning and passing as fast. His appetite became disordered in a new way. Enormous quantities of food and iced water swallowed at speed, followed by illness. He developed fixations on individual people that flipped between devotion and fury. His judgment of consequences, which had never been strong, collapsed. He began making public statements that no one at that court could safely hear, and he made them to anyone standing nearby. Read those symptoms with modern eyes, and they cluster in a way that would make any neurologist sit up. Damage to the frontal regions of the brain produces exactly this profile: impulsivity, emotional volatility, disinhibited speech, appetite dysregulation, and the loss of the internal brake that tells a person what not to say. Some researchers have argued instead for epilepsy following the head trauma, which is common after skull fracture. Others have pointed back at the bloodline. The inherited element is real, and it is not the whole answer. The narrowed Habsburg descent, with Juana of Castile standing in the tree twice, plausibly explains the crooked spine and the fragile constitution he was born with, and it explains nothing whatsoever about a man who was recognizably himself at 15 and recognizably not at 17. No diagnosis at this distance is settled, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling certainty that the evidence cannot support. The certainty we do have is enough, and it is devastating. The prince his father would eventually seal behind a nailed door was, in significant part, made on that staircase. The behavior that would be cited as proof of unfitness dates from after the injury. The man judged was not the boy born. And here is what nobody in that room ever wrote down. The physicians kept records. They described the wound, the swelling, the fever, the drainage, the trepan, the ointments, the diet, the pulse. Their notes are detailed and professional by the standards of their century. Not one of them recorded that his mind had changed. They had no category for it. A wound to the head was a wound to the flesh and the bone, and when the flesh healed, the case was closed. The idea that an injury to the skull could permanently alter who a person was did not exist in Spanish medicine in 1562, and so the single most consequential fact about the heir to the world's largest empire went unrecorded by the 8 men best placed to record it. Everyone else noticed. The ambassadors noticed and wrote home about it. The servants noticed. His tutors noticed. His father noticed most of all, and the king drew the only conclusion available to a man without the concept, that his son's character had revealed itself. From that summer forward, Philip began quietly gathering written observations of his son's conduct from the men around him, and that correspondence did not stop for 6 years. He never told Carlos it existed. What he was building it for, he explained to nobody. The peace that ended 60 years of war between Spain and France was signed at Cateau-Cambrésis in the spring of 1559. And, like every treaty of that century, it was sealed with a marriage. The bride was Elizabeth of Valois, eldest daughter of the King of France. The groom named in the negotiations from the beginning was Don Carlos. He was 14. She was 13. The betrothal had been discussed for years, and the prince knew about it, and there was no reason at all to think he was indifferent to it. A marriage was the one thing a Spanish heir could be given that actually belonged to him. The terms changed in the final weeks. Philip II had just been widowed by the death of Mary Tudor, and a king without a wife is a diplomatic asset that no negotiator leaves on the table. So the clause was rewritten. The princess who had been promised to the son was transferred to the father. Nobody consulted either of them. The prince learned that his bride was now his stepmother, the way he learned most things about his own life, which is to say, afterwards, from other people, in a room where he was expected to say nothing. If you have ever watched a decision get made about your life in a room you were not invited into, drop a line in the comments, because this next part is where that feeling turns into a policy that lasted 9 years. Consider what actually walked into Spain that winter. Elizabeth of Valois crossed the Pyrenees in the cold with a French household, having never seen the country she was to rule or the man she was to marry. She was 14 years old. She was married to a man of 32 who had already buried 2 wives, and she was introduced, in the same week, to a boy her own age who had been told for years that she would be his. The Spanish court reported that she wept on arrival, and that the French ladies around her wept with her. It also reported that she and Carlos took to each other immediately, which the court found charming and later found convenient. There is no arrangement on earth more cruel than the one that puts 2 children in the same room and tells them they were meant for each other and now must not be. It happened in Madrid in 1560. It has happened in 1,000 villages since, wherever the property mattered more than the people, and everyone watching understood it perfectly without a word being said. The affection between them was real, and it was almost certainly nothing like what Europe would later claim. Elizabeth was kind to him. That is the plain finding of everyone who was present. She spoke to him as an equal. She took his side in small household quarrels. She wrote to her mother in France about his health, and she was one of the very few people at that court whose interest in him was not professional. Carlos gave her presents constantly, which was how he expressed every attachment he ever had. 2 centuries later, a German playwright turned this into a doomed love affair, and an Italian composer turned that play into an opera, and the opera became the version of this story that most educated people in the world now carry in their heads. The passion is beautiful on a stage. It is invisible in the archive. No contemporary who was actually in that palace, not the Venetians who reported everything, not the imperial ambassadors, not the French who had every reason to watch the young queen closely, ever suggested a romance. They were friends. She was the only member of his own family who treated him as a person rather than as a problem. And the legend that made her his lover has obscured the far sadder truth that she was simply nice to him. Elizabeth died in childbirth in 1568 at 22, and by then, Carlos was already somewhere he could not be told about it. While the marriage was being rearranged over his head, something quieter and more permanent was happening to his career. He was given nothing. Understand what a prince of that age expected, because the pattern was identical in every monarchy in Europe. The heir was sent to war young, under an experienced commander, to acquire the reputation without the risk. He was given a governorship in one of the outlying territories to learn administration. He was placed on the councils of state so that the machinery of government became familiar before he had to run it. By his early 20s, a royal heir was normally doing real work with real consequences. Carlos was named President of the Council of State in name. He was given the formal titles of Prince of Asturias, Prince of Girona, Duke of Montblanc. He never commanded a single company of soldiers. He never governed a single province. He was permitted to sit in council and was never permitted to decide anything in it. The decision taken quietly after Alcalá was never announced, never written into any order, and never reversed. Philip simply never gave his son anything, year after year, and let the absence speak. The most eloquent thing in the entire Spanish archive of that decade is a list of appointments that Don Carlos is not on. What made it unbearable was who was on it. Don Juan of Austria was Philip's half-brother, the illegitimate son of the Emperor Charles V by a woman in Regensburg, and therefore Carlos's uncle. He was 3 years older than Carlos. He had been raised in Spain alongside him, in the same household, taught by some of the same men. He was handsome, athletic, charming in a way that made rooms rearrange themselves around him, and he was given command at sea while still in his 20s. Within a few years of this story, he would win the greatest naval victory of the century at Lepanto, and Europe would speak his name for 100 years. Alexander Farnese was Carlos's cousin, the son of his Aunt Margaret, and another boy from that same shared childhood. He was given real military responsibility young, and he became the finest field commander Spain produced in that entire century. The three of them grew up together. 2 of them were handed the world. The third watched from a chair with a title on it. The gap between the polished reports and the reality closed in the worst possible way. Philip had spent years reading edited accounts of a son he barely saw, and then he came home and looked, and what he saw after the fall confirmed every softened warning he had ever been sent. He did not conclude that his son was injured. He concluded that his son was unfit, and he began arranging the empire around that conclusion, without ever once saying it to the man it was about. Here is where this story stops being a family tragedy and becomes a state secret. Everything that happened in the following year, the orders, the interrogations, the written justifications, the correspondence between the king and his most trusted advisors, was gathered up and sealed. Not lost, sealed, deliberately, and kept out of every hand for generations, while Europe filled the vacuum with the most sensational explanation available. When those papers were finally worked through by historians, what they contained was not the crime the continent had spent 200 years assuming. The documents describe something colder than murder and considerably harder to forgive. By late 1567, Carlos had decided to give himself the job nobody would give him. The Netherlands were in revolt. Philip had sent the Duke of Alba north with an army and instructions that would make Alba's name a curse in Dutch for 4 centuries. The obvious alternative, a royal prince sent as governor, offering conciliation instead of gallows, had been discussed at court, and Carlos believed the post should have been his. He may even have been right. A Spanish heir in Brussels, extending a hand, might have changed that war. He was passed over, again, and this time for a soldier whose method was executions in the market square. So the prince made his own plan. He would leave Spain, travel to the Netherlands, and take up the government there by simply arriving. It was not a fantasy in the sense of being impossible. It was catastrophic in every other sense. An heir who leaves the kingdom without the king's license is not a governor. He is a rival court, and every enemy Spain had would have found him within a month. Carlos seems not to have thought about that at all, which is precisely what the men who watched him after Alcalá kept describing. He prepared it with alarming competence for a man with no judgment. He borrowed enormous sums through bankers in Seville. The figure discussed in the correspondence runs to hundreds of thousands of ducats, which was army money rather than travel money. He had a great chest built to carry documents and cash. He made arrangements for horses along the road. He sounded out grandees about whether they would follow him, and several gave the kind of answer that commits to nothing and reports everything. Then, in the last week before Christmas, he did the thing that ended it. He told Don Juan of Austria. The uncle he had grown up with, the one man at that court he seems genuinely to have trusted, the friend of his childhood who had every reason to keep faith with him. And Carlos laid the whole scheme out and asked him to come along. Don Juan listened. Don Juan said what a careful man says, which is very little. Then he left the room, took a horse, and rode straight to the king. What Philip did with that information over the following 4 days is the strangest thing in this entire story.
Carlos finally stopped waiting. I get that completely. His father spent years handing him titles, but never actual power. And at some point, you just have to move. But what destroys me is who he trusted with his plan. Don Juan, childhood friend, the one person he actually believed had his back. And what happens next, in the space of just 4 days, completely changes everything. So I'm curious, given everything you've seen about how this family works, what do you think Philip is going to do? Put your guess in the comments.
For 4 days, Philip II did nothing visible at all. He heard Mass. He signed papers. He received ambassadors and discussed the Netherlands with them in his usual, flat, careful voice. And not one of those men left the room suspecting anything. Meanwhile, the orders went out quietly to the men he trusted most, and a carpenter was told what would be needed and when. On the night of the 18th of January, 1568, the King of Spain put on armor. That detail has never stopped being astonishing. Philip was not a soldier and had not worn a breastplate in years, and there was nobody in that palace who could have harmed him. He put on a helmet and a mailcoat anyway, and he went down the corridor after midnight with 4 of his highest counselors and a small group of guards, and he opened his son's bedroom door himself. Carlos was asleep. His sword and his dagger had already been removed from the chamber, hours earlier, by a servant acting on the king's instruction. The men went first to the strong box by the bed and took the papers out of it. Then they woke him. What followed is one of the very few moments in this entire story where we have words rather than summaries, and they were written down by men who were standing in the room. Carlos understood immediately. He asked whether they had come to kill him. Philip answered that they had not, and that what was being done was for his own good, and for the good of the realm, a sentence that has been used to justify almost every confinement in human history. The prince told his father to kill him instead, and said, in substance, that this treatment was not proper for a son, but that a death would at least be an end. The carpenters worked around him while he was still speaking. They nailed the windows shut. They fixed the shutters. They removed everything from the chamber that could be used as a weapon or as a means to end his life, including his own knives from his table, and they took away the small silver things he had bought and given away all his life. Then Philip left. He walked out of that room in 1568, and he never saw his son alive again. Not one visit, not one letter to him, not one message that has ever been found. What the king had been quietly gathering for 6 years now had a purpose. The observations he had been collecting from the men around his son were not an anxious father's private record. They were a file, and in the days after the arrest, that file was worked into formal written justifications for the councils, for the Pope in Rome, and for the Emperor in Vienna. Philip explained the confinement as a matter of state and of conscience, a decision taken for reasons he would not enumerate. He never elaborated publicly again for the remaining 30 years of his life. The most powerful man on earth built a case against a young man who did not know a case existed. Now set that aside, because there was a person inside those nailed rooms, and almost nobody has ever bothered to describe him. Start with the money, since the ledgers survive, and ledgers do not flatter anyone. Don Carlos received one of the largest private incomes in Europe, and he retained almost none of it. He gave it away continuously, to his servants, to their families, to men who had served him once and then fallen ill, to people who simply came near him with a story. His father's accountants regarded this as a defect of character and reported it as such. Any modern reader of those same accounts sees something else. The gifts cluster around people with no power to repay them. He defended his household. When officials moved to dismiss a servant, Carlos fought it, sometimes furiously and sometimes stupidly, and more than once he won. In a court where everyone's loyalty ran upward to the king, the prince was the only man who spent his own capital protecting the people below him, and he did it for grooms and cooks who could give him nothing back. His letters survive in small numbers, and they are not the letters of a wild man. They are formal, short, sometimes awkward in construction, and entirely coherent. He asks after people's health. He thanks. He requests. There is no raving in them, at any date, before or after the fall. Then there is Flanders, which is the strongest single argument for his mind that exists. The Netherlands were burning because Madrid would not listen. The Flemish nobility had been sending complaints south for years, about taxes levied without consent, about the Inquisition operating outside local law, about their ancient privileges being ignored by Spanish officials who did not speak their language. The Council of State treated those complaints as insolence and answered them with the Duke of Alba. Carlos read them differently. He met with Flemish envoys. He listened to men that the entire government had decided in advance were rebels, and he took their grievances seriously enough that the Netherlanders themselves began to speak of him with hope. The Baron de Montigny, sent from Brussels to plead the Flemish case, found in the prince the one sympathetic ear in Spain. Montigny was later arrested and secretly strangled in a Spanish castle on Philip's orders, which tells you exactly how much the king valued that channel. The judgment being ridiculed at that court turned out, within a decade, to be correct. Alba's method produced a war that ran for 80 years and cost Spain more silver than the Americas could supply. The heir who was declared unfit to govern had privately reached the conclusion that history would reach. Here is the smallest thing he did, and it is the one that stays with me. In the years before the arrest, a member of his household fell seriously ill. One of the men who dressed him and carried his messages, of no importance to anybody. Carlos sent his own physicians. He paid for the man's treatment out of his allowance, and when the family could not manage, he paid for them too. His father's officials noted the expense with irritation and recorded it as further evidence of a prince who could not be trusted with money. Almost every one of us has been the person nobody at the top of the building could name, and almost every one of us remembers the one senior person who noticed anyway.
That is what his servants had in him, and it is why the men closest to him stayed loyal long after loyalty stopped being profitable. The court called that weakness. Everyone who actually worked for him called it something else, and they went on saying so after his death, when there was nothing left to gain by it. The most painful fact in this entire story is that he understood his position perfectly. He knew he was not being punished for the Flanders scheme alone, because the scheme had been reckless rather than treasonous, and everyone, including his father, knew it. He knew he was being removed. He knew what he was worth to the state, a name on a succession, a body that had to keep breathing until an alternative existed, and no more than that. The confinement was not a sentence with a term. It had no end written into it, because the thing it was waiting for was his death or his father's. So he did the only things a man in a sealed room can still decide. He refused food. For days at a stretch, he ate nothing at all, and the servants who brought his meals took them away untouched and reported it and were told to keep bringing them. Then he would break and eat enormously, whole pies and quantities of meat swallowed at speed, and be violently ill afterwards. He drank iced water in volumes his physicians recorded with alarm. In the heat of a Madrid summer, in a room he could not leave, he had ice brought in and packed around the chamber and slept in the cold, and then walked barefoot on the tiles. Physicians of that century read this as derangement. A modern reader can see a man using the only lever he had left, in the only place the world had not yet reached, which was the inside of his own body. His requests in those last weeks were small, and they are all documented. He asked for his confessor. He asked to see his stepmother Elizabeth, the one person in that palace who had ever been kind to him, and she was not permitted to come. He asked for news of the outside. He asked, at the end, whether his father would see him. Every one of those requests was refused, politely, by men who had their orders. He died on the 24th of July, 1568, in the small hours, in a room in the Alcázar of Madrid, whose windows had been nailed shut for 6 months. He was 23 years old. The end came quickly at the last. Through the summer, his body had been failing under the cycle of starvation and excess, and by the middle of July, he could not keep food down at all. Dysentery took hold, which in that century killed healthy soldiers in a week and killed a wasted young man faster. He was given the sacraments. He made a will in which he asked that his debts be paid and that his servants be provided for, which is exactly what a man who had spent his life giving money away would think of on the last day of it. His father did not come. Philip sent word that he could not bear to be present, and he remained elsewhere in the same building while his only son died a few corridors away. The physicians wrote a report. It described the fluxes, the fever, the refusal of food, the failure of the pulse, and the hour of death. They noted the disorder of his eating and the ice. They said nothing at all about the 6 months behind a sealed door, nothing about what the confinement had done to a man already injured, and nothing about the fracture in his skull that had changed him 6 years earlier. The record is clinically precise and historically silent, which had been true of every document about this young man since the day he was born. The body was carried to the convent of Santo Domingo el Real in a monk's habit, with the funeral honors of a prince of Asturias. Philip walked in the procession. Elizabeth of Valois outlived her stepson by 10 weeks. She died on the 3rd of October in childbirth at 22. The second wife Philip lost that way in the same year that took his heir. 2 deaths in one household in one summer, and Spain's enemies were handed the most useful story of the century. It took 12 years to be written, and it was written by the one man in Europe with the strongest possible motive. William of Orange was leading the Dutch revolt against Philip and had just been outlawed with a price on his head. His answer was a printed document called the Apology, published in 1580, and it is one of the most effective pieces of political writing ever produced. It accused Philip II of murdering his own son and then murdering his own wife, and it added an incest motive for good measure by claiming that Carlos and Elizabeth had been lovers. There is no evidence for any of it, and William did not need any. He needed a tyrant, and a man who kills his family is the most portable tyrant there is. The Apology was translated into French, German, English, and Latin within months, and it traveled everywhere the printing presses of Protestant Europe could reach. That pamphlet is the reason you have probably heard some version of this story before. 2 centuries later, Friedrich Schiller built a play on it, in which Carlos is a noble young idealist in love with his stepmother and destroyed by a cold father in the Inquisition. Then Giuseppe Verdi set the play to music, and the opera has been performed continuously ever since. Millions of people have wept for Don Carlos in an opera house. Almost none of them have wept for the actual man, who was small and crooked and could not finish a sentence, and who died because his father decided he must never be free again. Now weigh it honestly, because the sealed papers eventually came out. The state documents on the arrest were closed for generations, and when historians finally worked through the archives at Simancas and elsewhere, they found the king's justifications, the councilors' memoranda, the correspondence with Rome and with Vienna, and the household records of the confinement. What they did not find was an order to kill. Not a coded instruction, not a payment, not a hint in the letters of men who wrote to each other about far darker business without embarrassment. Philip had Montigny strangled in secret, and that operation left traces in the record. A killing of the heir would have left traces too. The plainest argument against the murder is the arrest itself. A man who wanted his son dead quietly would never have put on armor, gathered 4 senior counselors as witnesses, nailed the windows in front of servants, and then written to the Pope and the Emperor explaining that his heir was confined. Poison is what you use when you cannot do the thing openly. Philip did the thing openly. The rival readings deserve to be named as readings rather than verdicts. Some historians hold that Carlos died of the dysentery and the self-starvation, and nothing more. Others argue that the confinement itself was the instrument, that a man in his condition, sealed in a room and refused everything he asked for, was being allowed to die at a pace nobody would have to sign for. A few still keep the poison open on the grounds that absence of a document proves little in a state that burned documents. Every one of those positions has serious scholars behind it, and no honest account settles it. What is settled is the cost, and the cost was paid by people who never had a vote in any of it. Philip II was 41 years old and had no heir. He had buried 3 wives and his only surviving son inside a decade, and the largest empire on earth had nobody to inherit it. So he did the thing his family had done for 4 generations. In 1570, he married Anna of Austria, the daughter of his own sister, which made her his niece by blood, and she had been, until recently, the intended bride of Don Carlos. She gave him 5 children. 4 of them died in childhood. The one who survived became Philip III, and he married a Habsburg cousin, and his son, Philip IV, married his own niece. And the arithmetic that opened this story kept compounding in exactly the direction it had always been going. It ended in a man named Charles II, born in 1661. His jaw was so malformed that he could not chew his food properly. He did not walk until he was old enough to have been at school, could not read until far past the normal age, suffered seizures throughout his life, and was ruled for him by his mother and then by his ministers. His genealogists could not tell him what modern geneticists have since calculated, that his parents were closer in blood than most brothers and sisters. He died in 1700 without a child, and the Spanish Habsburgs ended with him, and Europe fought a 13-year war over the vacancy. No enemy destroyed that dynasty, no invasion, no revolution, no rival house. It married itself out of existence, one dispensation at a time, and Don Carlos was the first of them whose ruin the whole continent watched. Go back to the portrait in Madrid, the pale young man in black velvet with the level shoulders and the hand on the table. Everything in that painting is a decision. The shoulders were leveled by a painter who knew better. The limp is hidden by the pose. The stammer cannot be painted at all, so it simply is not there. That portrait is the version of him that the Spanish crown required to exist, and for 4 centuries it has hung on a wall being looked at by people who were never told what was underneath it. Where you place the blame is genuinely open, and I am not going to close it for you. You can put it on the family, which married inward for money until it produced a body that could not carry the weight it was born into. You can put it on the physicians, who bored a hole in a boy's skull to save his life, succeeded, and then never noticed that the person who woke up was someone else. You can put it on the century, which had no concept for a brain injury and therefore called it a character. Or you can put it on the father, who had 6 years to understand what a staircase had done to his son, chose instead to build a file, and never went back through that door. What is not open is what Don Carlos was. He was a young man who gave away almost everything he was given, defended servants who could do nothing for him, and listened to the Flemish when the entire government of Spain refused to. And every one of those things was recorded as a fault. If these are the kinds of stories you want more of, subscribing is the whole of what keeps them being made. 132 years later, another Spanish king was born who could not chew his own bread, and he was the last of them. His name was Charles. That story is coming.
What strikes me most about Don Carlos is that everything he was condemned for, giving away his money, protecting servants, listening to Flanders, was actually kindness, and a court full of powerful men called it weakness. 4 centuries later, we still know him through a forged story and an opera, not through the ledgers that show a young man spending his last moments thinking about paying his debts. What I keep asking myself is how many stories like this we've already lost, where the sealed door was so complete, we never even learned someone was behind it. If you think the answer matters, write it in the comments.